All right, thank you so much, Gard. Thanks also to Matthias and to Everett for hosting me here today. I'm really excited by this event. I'm excited to hear about the overall research program that you all are undertaking. It's cool. And thank you to Julia for that, for kicking us off with that great paper, and to Niklas and 16 for providing crucial commentary. So what I'm going to talk through today is a piece I just wrote, which actually just came out in an online magazine in the US, Spectre. And so, but I want to frame it in a particular way because it's a little offshoot of a research project that I'm undertaking. I'm less interested here. I'm less interested in the history of the commune than I am in the history of the commune, if that makes sense. Because the larger project that this is part of is a sort of research into the history of history from below, which is two things, really. It's necessarily ambiguous. On the one hand, it's a genre of history writing. But it's also a particular thesis, a thesis that is supposed to be recorded, as it were, in the genre of historical writing. The genre is supposed to record the making of history from below, and this is obviously this has its origins in the socialist movements of the 19th century. At least in a self-conscious way, and in many ways it has its origins, I think, in the International Workingmen's Association, and in the claim that Marx's claim in the inaugural address, that the emancipation of the working class will be the task of the working class itself, right? The idea is not just that the masses make history, but that the masses make their own emancipation. And in so doing, make freedom more generally. So to really generalize, you could say that actually history from below, at least in its origins as a mode of historical writing and as a thesis, has a sort of telos, a telos of universal emancipation. However, this universal emancipation is conceptualized. And the belief in the masses making history is the belief in the masses' struggles making this universal emancipation. Now, I think that for me, Lissagaray's history of the Paris Commune, and that's what I'll mostly be talking about today, is a crucial document in this history of history from below. Because it really, I think, initiates a series running through Trotsky's history of the 1917 revolution, C.L.R. James's The Black Jacobins, W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, Georges Lefebvre's history of the French Revolution of 1789 and through 1792. This is a particularly important chain of texts that help to form this tradition of writing. And what they examined were the makings of revolutions, right? And Lissagaray's history really, I think, kicks this off. But Lissagaray's history is not one text, which is an interesting thing, and I think this has to be kept in mind. There's the text that Lissagaray himself wrote in French, right? And that was published in 1876. There's also the translations of that into German in 1877 and into English in 1886. The German translation that was carried out like under Marx's very close supervision, and Marx kicked two translators off the task. And ended up doing a lot of work on that himself. And as there's just a brand new essay in historical materialism by Daniel Gaido that shows all of the amendments and additions that Marx made to the German text of the history of the Commune. And obviously this was partly because Marx thought this was an incredibly important document for the growing German socialist and workers' parties, right? He thought that this was really important for the Socialist Democratic Workers' Party. And this is an effort on Marx's part to influence the trajectory and growth of the German movement, and to draw lessons from the French experience for the German movement. And there's a lot that could be said there that I'm not going to say. But these additions and amendments to the text were preserved by and large, and given some slight changes in Eleanor Marx's English translation in 1886. But a lot of them actually disappear. I mean, they weren't in the original French text, and then when Lissagaray revised it for the second French edition, he pared some of that stuff down even more. So some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about is much more apparent in the German and the English versions of the text than in either of the French versions, and certainly than in the second French version. So that's sort of the background. And what I'm interested in is the sort of the difference between the sort of history that Lissagaray is doing and the more recent histories of the Paris Commune. Not generally, I mean, there's a lot of different varieties of these, but I would say that there's, and this is something that Julia talked about, right, that there has been this transformation in how the Paris Commune is conceived in histories of France and in histories of the 19th century. And obviously Fourier and revisionism is a huge influence here. And I want to push on one thing here. I think, you know, when Fourier says that basically the Commune is the end of the masses making history, the end, it shows the futility of the revolutionary masses and brings an end to this revolutionary cycle. I mean, this is a part of the liberal historiography that, as Julia said, and I would generalize that to the point of saying that liberalism generally is committed to the futility or perversity of the self-emancipation of the masses. And what is particularly provokes me, though, is that there's a certain sort of harmonization or there are like concessions, I think, made to this basically liberal belief in some of the more recent accounts of the Commune, coming from people who are much more sympathetic to the Commune. So making history, and this is part of the larger sweep of things, making history came to be seen in certain regards as only, you know, making history only in the sense of making interruptions in history, only making sort of pinpricks in the tableau of history, and that's what the masses are capable of, or making history only in the sense of sort of making a tableau of their own suffering, making a sort of martyrology, and that's sort of my taking off point. And I think so. I think the most prominent recent books on the Commune reinforce a sort of dual picture of the Commune as possessing a sort of dream-filled life and a horrific death, and that this sort of exhausts the Commune as an event. So John Merriman, the eminent historian of modern Europe, entitled his 2014 History of the Commune simply Massacre, right? You know, wrapped in somber black, adorned by a chiaroscuro rendering of Paris in flames. Merriman's book is just lavish in detailing the deaths that attended and followed the Commune's brief existence. I would say half the words of the text are devoted to describing the deaths of communards. As if in a rebuke, 2015 delivered Kristen Ross's Communal Luxury, which is militantly devoted to the political imaginary of the communards, and is obviously, it's, you know, bedecked in splendid and Pacific teal, William Morris's floral design there. And Ross's focus is entirely on the hopes and aspirations of the commune arts and those they inspired. And for her, the scale of those dreams is really important. Unlike the scale of the commune arts deaths, their dreams, the scale of their dreams is livable, not sublime. Right? But I think this choice between dying and dreaming, between the unimaginable and imagination itself, did not always define the memory of the commune or the history of the commune. And so what I want to do is look at the first history of the commune, published in Belgium first, a short 5 years after the events. Prosper Olivier Lissagaray's Histoire de la Commune. So it was translated into German the next year, as I said, and in English in 1886. And obviously it's still highly regarded. Robert Toombs, not exactly a bit of a revisionist himself, still calls Lissagaray's work, after more than a century, arguably the best general history of the commune. But what is striking to me is that when you turn to this work, and it's hefty, for those of you who haven't read it, it's a substantial work. You don't find, at least in the first instance, either communal luxury or massacre. Instead, you find an effort, impressive in scope and precise in detail, to explain the rise and fall of the commune, its operations and its failings, and its organization and its disorganization. So Lissagaray was a lifelong journalist, and his history is really a grand work of rapportage. He believed that it was his duty to tell the truth about the commune, both to combat the slanders of the victorious Third Republic, and to give a true accounting, and I think this is the most important thing, to give a true accounting to those who were inspired by the commune and sought to make it again and to make it better. So he writes in his preface that the children have the right to know the reason for their parents' defeat. And this means resisting not only the victor's history, but also what he calls the revolutionary myths and sensational stories of those who are attached in some way to the loss. I think this insistence on the factual truth of words spoken and things done, of the what and the why, is a valuable counterweight to both the sensationalism that attends depictions of the commune's horrific end, and the mythologizing that attends efforts to recover its sort of disclosed possibilities. Lissagaray took for granted that a revolutionary uprising by the proletariat and a consequent remaking of the social and political world by that same class was both desirable and was on the agenda. And for this reason, his history treats the course of events in Paris as a failed attempt to do what is to be done, right? And thus as a source of practical lessons, both positive and negative. Lissagaray was not himself a great tactician, as I think he proved quite aptly by a series of rather disastrous political maneuvers within the French Marxist scene in the 1880s. Basically, he tacked at first to try to link up with Bruce and Malon, and then that didn't work, and then he sort of heaped a bunch of abuse on Bruce and tacked to the other direction and tried to link up with the sort of the circle around the circle around Guest and Lafargue, although he hated Lafargue and Lafargue hated him. So there was a whole series of conflicts there. And if you read some of the correspondence, especially Engels's correspondence with the German socialists, you see details of all of this. It's quite a disaster. But despite the fact that he was not himself much of a tactician, I think he is a sharp observer of the dynamics that hobbled and undermined the commune from its first weeks of existence. And what Lissagaray saw above all was that the citizens of Paris did not take seriously the inevitability of civil war. In his words, They, quote, could never understand that the commune was a barricade, not a government. This was the general error, he continues, the superstitious belief in their governmental longevity. So at first, this didn't seem to be true. The first official act of the Central Committee of the National Guard, the agency that actually declared the commune on the 18th of March, was to order barricades built around the parts of the city through which the victorious Prussian army was to parade on the 1st of March. The point was to keep the Prussian soldiers and the Parisian guardsmen isolated from one another. They saw that any attack on the Prussians by Parisians would result in an immediate overthrow of the Republic by Bismarck. And as much as the National Guard hated and distrusted the new government of France, led by Adolphe Thiers and controlled by a majority of monarchist representatives, they understood that a Prussian-installed government would be worse, and so they held their fire. At this initial stage, this is before the commune is declared, the National Guard operated, according to Lissagaray, as an insurance company against a coup d'etat. And its central committee was therefore merely what Lissagaray calls a sentinel. For precisely this reason, it could draw on very broad support, both within and beyond the National Guard battalions. Paris was the stronghold of Republican sentiment, and so a near consensus on that question united broad swaths of the population who would not have been able to agree on any more positive set of aims. When Thiers' government turned against Paris and tried to seize the National Guard's 250 cannon on the 18th, therefore, this spirit of unanimity carried over to the defenses of the cannon and the declaration of the commune. But as the city busied itself with preparing for communal elections, making the broad social revolution that followed from Paris's proletariat being in charge of the whole city, it also turned inward. They did not even shut the gates. The Journal Officiel in Versailles called it a civil war, but according to Lissagaray, Paris didn't notice. The commune did not see, he says, that it was now engaged in a life and death struggle with the Assembly of Versailles. As a consequence, despite the heady excitement of the first weeks of the commune's existence, a shadow hung over everything. The Central Committee set communal elections for the 26th, but there had been very few public meetings to establish the mandates of those elected. There was no process of public opinion formation or any setting of aims. Instead of voting for a program, Lissagaray writes, therefore the people of Paris voted for names. In place of the Central Committee, unadorned with great men and devoted to a simple and single purpose, the new council of the commune, quote, abounded in chapels, groups, semi-celebrities, and hence endless competition and rivalry. The thing about a clear minimal program is that it allows people to set aside their other differences for the sake of a common project. You're not asked to agree about very much, which means that the cost of cooperation to your self-perception and to your other concerns is low, right? The alternative, though, is what Lissagaray saw taking hold in Paris during the Commune. Valuing voluntary association above all else, the communards sought out or created groups in which they could enjoy the greatest possible agreement and pursue the most fully articulated projects of reform and transformation. They dreamed of autonomy and meant to enjoy what they had of it while it lasted. But, and this is quoting Lissagaray again, holy autonomy, which forbade interfering with the autonomy of one's neighbors, close quote, thereby also forbade arming the neighboring communes in order to attack Versailles. National Guard battalions were left alone, Lissagaray argues, each to do what it willed with whatever resources it could muster on its own. And people defected left and right. I think this is a very important element of Lissagaray's story. The commune may have had 60,000 men under arms in late March, but by the time the real fighting began, they had only about 20,000 men and women doing the fighting. The voting rolls dropped precipitously as citizens fled, especially, but not exclusively, those from the wealthier districts. Since everything depended upon self-identifying with the commune and its affiliated associations, this self-disidentification sapped the commune of its strength. Lissagaray thought that the only chance was for the commune to appeal to the rest of France. The city, he thought, needed the provinces in order to survive, but the provinces needed the city in order to be free. The commune fought for so that this sort of reconstructs, this is not just in the history, but this is also at the time, contemporaneously, Lissagaray was writing a paper in, he had 2 papers in Paris during the Commune. And in his first, he had a lengthy editorial asking the Council of the Commune to carry out, to declare a program and to communicate this program to the provinces. And so part of what I'm doing here is reconstructing his original call, as well as his recollections of this in the history. His proposal was that the commune should declare to the provinces, look, we fight for the republic, and the commune's enemy, our enemy, the central government with its taxes, its bureaucrats, and its coalition of monarchists eager to reinstate one royal house or the other, is also the enemy of you, the provinces, of you, the peasant in particular. And thus, the commune does not want to impose Paris's dream of workers' cooperatives and social revolution on the peasants. This is what Lissagaray wanted the commune to say. But rather, we want to join you in removing the obstacles to your dreams. This was his imagined address. But the council of the commune made no such appeal. And when it did publish a program, a declaration, when it did make appeals to the provinces, they tended to take the form of saying, instead of pledging to fight for the liberty of the provinces, they tended to declare that Paris works and suffers for all of France, and that the provinces therefore had a duty to fight for Paris, who was their savior. That is, they tended to preach rather than promise. And I think we can condense then and generalize the practical lessons that Lissagaray drew from the commune under 4 headings. First, social movements for liberation should expect resistance and should plan for the eventuality of opposition. Armed civil war may be forestalled or avoided altogether, but not by pretending it can't happen. The current social order, by definition, has powerful constituencies in favor of its continuance in perpetuity. Real interests are threatened by any substantial effort to change the world, and no one should expect those real interests to evaporate in the light of one's moral principle or moral example. Second, therefore, the forces of revolution must agree on a minimum program that can unite as broad a coalition as possible. Robin D.G. Kelley is certainly right that, and he's not alone in saying this, I feel like this has become a sort of common sense, that the conditions and very existence of social movements enable freedom dreams, right? Imagined worlds of possibility. But those freedom dreams are going to remain heterogeneous to one another, and counting on a shared dream to hold the movement together in the face of committed opposition is bound to failure. Third, any revolution will need the assistance of non-revolutionaries, just as the commune needed aid and assistance from the French provinces if it were ever going to survive. The enemies of any movement of liberation will also have other enemies. The movement, to have any hope of success, will have to appeal both, it'll have to do 2 things. It has to appeal to the enemies of my enemies, right? But it has to do so in the full cognizance of the fact that they are not, therefore, my friends, right? And for Lissagaray and for those, I think, who follow after in this particular lineage of history from below, movements can hope to do so only by repeatedly and loudly saying how the liberation that they seek will also free these non-revolutionary segments of the population to live as they wish. And finally, the surest sign that any movement of liberation is strong and healthy is that it is pushing to the fore previously unknown figures. Lissagaray damns all of those who fail to recognize the force manifesting itself through unknown men, as he says, and measures the vitality of the Central Committee and the Council of the Commune by the extent to which l'inconnu predominate in their makeup. Right? The reliance on the previously unknown both keeps the movement close to the grassroots and indicates the strength of the popular mandate behind the minimum program. As semi-celebrities come to dominate the movement, so do cliques and contests among personalities. I think you can find echoes of all of these four themes in that chain of text that I mentioned, and that I think sets this sort of like archipelago of histories from below off from the broader tradition of history from below as it developed in the 20th century. And I just think that these practical lessons of the communards are worth recalling, and of Lissagaray's history are worth recalling today, alongside the more familiar sort of melancholy regarding the martyrdom of the communards or the celebration of their utopian imaginaries. Like Lissagaray's history certainly celebrates and heroizes the communards, especially the obscure men and women who populated the meetings, built and defended the barricades, and proposed and discussed the mandates binding their delegates to the council. In this regard, I think it has to be regarded as a founding document of history from below. The everyday workers and shopkeepers of Paris were not passive victims of historical circumstance, according to Lissagaray, but active makers and shapers of their own history. But in contrast to the social histories and micro histories that came to dominate historical attention to the agency of common people in the 20th century, Lissagaray portrays the working classes of Paris as the agents of revolution, not as the agents of cultural production or the agents of resistance or the agents of self-fashioning, right? I think there's a real contrast between what Lissagaray is up to and what someone like E.P. Thompson is up to in the making of the English working class. There's no account of like making experience and thereby making culture and thereby making the class itself. That's not his project. Movements for liberation, sorry, I'm skipping over something. So for Lissagaray, making history means making revolution, but making history by making revolution also means making mistakes, right? Movements for liberation create freedom dreams, but not necessarily the means for realizing them. And the risk of focusing only on the beauty of the dreams or the agony of the loss is that we lose sight of the fact that, I think this is the biggest lesson of Lissagaray's history, that the communards were trying to do something and they failed, right? Their failure too is part of the history that they made. And if we don't want to fail too, then we have to heed Lissagaray when he writes, there might be something more terrible than the defeat, to misconstrue or to forget its causes. Thank you very much.